like this here swimming that I forget. Oh, that's so nice.
It's for
I
children.
need a bigger chair. I need a bigger table now.
That's me.
Okay. I'm not going to, if you are sort of thinking about math and how this fits, I don't have a math background, so that's for Shakna and her team to do those kinds of things. And I really don't, while I kind of like little people, I wouldn't teach them. I have a background in secondary teaching, high school, and my field was social studies, but that's been so long ago is that it's truly our historical archive. So I'm going to be trying to talk a bit about cultural responsive teaching more in general ways, and then we can see whether or not we can begin to fit that around particular areas that you might be concerned with. I thought what I would do is to talk a bit about the domain of cultural responsive teaching, and then after we've done that, maybe we can engage in some conversation. And I do have the questions that you thought about, and I would like to at least address some of them, if not all, so that you won't feel that it was useless exercise, that you just did it, and that's all it was doing. What I want to encourage you is to not try to write down everything that I'm going to say, but see if you can find things that resonate with you and just record those. And then just kind of see if you can stay with the flow of what this thing is about, what the conversation might be about. And the way in which I want to kind of do this is, I want to wait a bit about how do you do cultural responsive teaching in practice. Because I think that there are some preludes that should precede that. And part of those preludes should be how do we as facilitators of teaching and learning, how do we get ourselves in a position of readiness to do an adequate job of cultural responsive teaching? And I know that if you're like a lot of practitioner-based educators in my world, you really want to know what to do and how to do it on Wednesday afternoon at 2:03 or whatever, that degree of specificity. But, and while I think I might appreciate the need to do that, I don't think that really is a constructive course to go toward for some reasons that I could explain, but not now, but later on. So what I want to do is to kind of talk about the nature of cultural responsive teaching, and then I want to mention that what I think might be some, if you will, some boundaries, some frameworks that I think that we need to have that come out of the field, so that when we get to the point of practice, we are not all over the place. Because sometimes there are a lot of things that may be good in and of themselves that people will claim to be culturally responsive, just simply are not. And I think if we bastardize the concept, we've already lost the game. So that's kind of what I thought what I would do. And maybe the first way to begin is to talk about what cultural responsive teaching is not. And one of them is cultural responsive teaching, first of all, is not just for kids that's got problems. And unfortunately, that sometimes it's been cast that way. And in some ways that's understandable, because so much of what we think as education reform and improving education begins in a problem-based type thing and then moves forward. But in effect, cultural responsive teaching tries to do the reverse. So the whole notion there is when you look in the field, it really is what some scholars are now calling asset-based or strength-based. So the idea is for us to move away from sort of a pathological orientation as we think about children of color, of what they don't have and what they can't do, and then we're going to fix them. That's kind of the medical model of education. You go to the doctor when you got a problem, or you got to. They cost too much otherwise. Or if you get to a certain point, you say, well, I'll go to the doctor as a preventive measure. But for the most part, we tend to go to a doctor to be fixed, to be corrected, to be cured of some issue that we have. So that kind of notion has grown into working with children in school, particularly children of color, underserved populations who may not be doing well academically. So the problem with that, though, is that embedded within that is the implicit idea that there's something inherently wrong with the children. And to me, that cultural responsive teaching steps away from that kind of notion and challenges us to say that there's nothing wrong with kids, at least before they come to us. But something might happen to wrong them after they are with us because of something that is happening or not happening in the schooling process. So implicit within cultural responsive teaching is that the problem, the issues, the challenge are not rest with the student, but it rests within the environment, the education environment, the system that we expose them to. And part of that system is because it begins with saying, it focuses itself on there's something that's inherently wrong with the kids, whether or not that's directly wrong or indirectly. You know, it's either wrong with the kids or something wrong with their parents. And one of the ways in which you see that is that something wrong with these kids because they're not learning. And that's just simply not true. You know, people are always learning. They may not be learning what you want them to learn, but kids are learning. So maybe that's one misconception that we need to flip upside down and assume that kids are learning something under some circumstances, and they're learning some very powerful kinds of things. Some of the same kids that you have in classrooms that you say can't learn reading or can't get this basic math problem, outside of classroom, they're very proficient. You know, doing incredible kinds of things, you know, making little words of their own. You know, I mean, really, and doing some very valuable kinds of contributions to their families, to their siblings, and if nothing else, just living their little lives, kind of stuff like that. I've got some, I call them three little sisters. Well, not three, actually seven of them. 7 little sisters, and these are little kids, they happen to be all girls, who are in my family. And I've been kind of watching them. I don't mean that in a pejorative way, but I've been observing them to just kind of see what they do. First of all, they're incredibly capable. Their vocabularies are unbelievable. And when I first started to do this, they were like 3 or 4 years old. They come from a mixture of backgrounds. Some of them in the group have never had any formal schooling at 3. They had been to preschool, they had been to nursery school and all of that. They had been to granted school, you know, that kind of stuff and all of that. But it was it's just amazing how much these little girls know. And I'm thinking when they get to school, what is going to happen to them? Will schools appreciate what they already know and build from that point into something else? So cultural responsive teaching then it begins there, is knowing what kids know already and are capable of doing, and then pushing beyond that, or using that as a launch, as a basis for them to perform in some other areas. Now what that also means is that cultural responsive teaching then is not just about including new content in the existing curriculum. Okay? And for some reason, in the educational arena, we tend to go there because we place so very often we place the responsibility and the burden of change, the benefit of change, if there's such, on curriculum content. And that's important, but that's not enough. So it's not just about finding some new information about different ethnic groups and putting it into reading and math and science and social studies and spelling and whatever else you teach and all of that. That's important, but basically in cultural responsive teaching, that is kind of minuscule. It's the least important thing in cultural responsive teaching. But rather, cultural responsive teaching really is a pedagogical process. It's a teaching mechanism. It's a system of strategies and behaviors. It's how you deliver instruction about whatever to whom. That's the influence of cultural responsive teaching. So in some ways, you could set aside, I don't suggest you do that, but just for the sake of argument, you could set aside the content issue and just simply say, we have to teach what is on our plate already, but you still have to teach that to kids who are different. And those kids bring their differences to bear into your teaching and learning, and it affects how they teach and learn, just as you do. You know, we as teachers are cultural beings. Kids are cultural beings. We're already operating out of cultural systems. That's one reason why kids don't understand what we're talking about. There's a culture of our profession. And when you think about what is culture, all of these different kind of elements of culture, one of which is that every culture creates a language to serve its own purposes. So as professional educators, you have a language that you do, and as I said to my students, we as teachers talk funny. I mean, other teachers understand our funny talk, but if you're not a teacher, let's say you're a parent, and we habitually talk in our professional language, parents think we're talking funny. It may be likely that kids are not doing as well in your classroom, some of them, because they don't understand what you're talking about. It is not their intellectual ability, it's just don't understand the words you use, because you're doing that funny talk. So, do you know how you talk as an educator with kids? And why should kids understand us first as educators and as old people? You know, you're talking about what, 5 to 10-year-olds in your school? Kindergarten to 5th grade, 5 to 10-year-olds, maybe 5 to 11 by the time they get out of. And let's see, the youngest person around the table, maybe you're 23 or 5. You're still old, you know, guys, because you're probably sitting here thinking, yeah, I know, you know, when you look over there, somebody got gray hair, like I know who she's talking about. Like, I'm talking about you too. 25 years old, and you're teaching a 5th grader. That's 15 years. Yeah. Think about all the things that have happened in 15 years. And then we do kind of sort of silly stuff in that. We think we're going to really hook up with kids and say, well, when I was your age. Because that's a historical artifact. You know, I mean, if you're 25 or 35, when you were 8 or 9 years old, that's no connection. The kids would not even imagine, least of all conceived. And all of the things that have happened in between that. I mean, look at these little people. They know how to do computers and they don't even know how to read. And you, if you're like me, you read the manual and you still have to ask a 7-year-old, what does this mean? You know, kind of interpret this for. So part of what that means then, if we're going to deliver instruction to kids who are different, regardless of what it is you're trying to teach, you still are obligated to do cultural responsiveness. Because kids learn differently. Kids have different frames of references. Kids have different motivational kinds of stuff. And much of those kinds of things are filtered or influenced through their cultural socialization. Just as how we talk, think, how we value, are informed by our cultural socialization. So one of the things that cultural responsive teaching then is trying to do is to bridge the gap between us as teachers and our students as students. And it's not a one gap, but it's a gap in a lot of different kind of ways. There are lots of gaps going on. One of them is an age gap. Another one could indeed be, if not a racial gap, an ethnic gap. Because if you're teaching black kids and you're a black teacher, you still might be at a gap. You know, because of all different kinds of complexities and all of that kind of stuff. The few of you around the table who are male gender, I mean, you're a novelty. Kids might not be able, especially if you're teaching, what's that, 2nd and 3rd? What was that, 2nd? 3rd grade, like, ooh. Oh, man. Ooh. Teacher. I mean, that could be just totally derailed by the captivation and novelty of your presence. Because you're rare. You know, look at that, don't blush at that. You see, black folks don't blush, we just feel funny. You know what I mean? Okay. And even something like that, while it's not a negative, it's a positive kind of thing to be fascinated and all of that kind of stuff into that human discovery. It could interfere with attending to a reading lesson and concentrating on that. So then cultural responsive teaching suggests is that you can't deal with just academics, but rather there is more at play. Even in academics, there's more than academics. So if you say you want to teach kids reading, there is more to learning reading than working on reading. And we know some of that. We know, for example, if children are hungry, that might have a negative consequence on their attention span. We know if they feel under threat and anxiety, you know, that can derail their attending tasks and all of those kinds of stuff. So we know this. But we also know then that is what research is telling us is that if you deal with learning comprehensively, you will get better performance academically. So if you deal with their social development, their cultural development, their racial development, their gender development. As you're teaching math and reading and science, the kids will perform better in math and reading and science. Because they're all, this academic stuff does not happen in isolation, but rather it is taking place in a multidimensional context and all of that. And we know that as human beings, and we know that as adults. We just forget sometimes. You know, you are, for example, when you're teaching and you think you're really teaching, think about your overall psycho-emotional disposition or state of being. And let's say that, unfortunately, you're not teaching very well at this moment because just before you got ready to come to school that morning, somebody in your life messed with you, and you got pissed off. And you arrived at school angry, disconcerted, kind of, as Granny would say, combobulated. I don't know what that means, but you kind of get my point. You're just not quite there. You are uncentered. You're derailed. And then you go in the classroom and you just want to, like, every little kid get on your last nerve. They didn't do a thing to you. It's just their presence get on your nerves. Because you're not really ready to be the best way. So you're not performing to the best of your ability because your psycho-emotional sense of being is not needed to be. Well, the same thing happens with kids. Sometimes kids are not performing well in school, have nothing at all to do with the academics, but it's where they are in their sense of their being, their human being, that has an impact on the academic performance. So co-responsive teaching says you've got to teach that little child. And that shouldn't be too hard for you as elementary teachers because you're much better at that than secondary. Secondary, we have always been, we thought we were better than you actually. But we have always focused on, our professional training has been on teaching content, teaching subjects. And we've been as arrogant and bold enough to say, well, we don't teach kids, we teach subjects. That if you're not learning our subject, that's your problem. I'm going to teach my subject. And elementary, your socialization is just reverse, professional socialization. You focus, you center on children, and that whole child. So in many ways then, coach-responsive teaching segues very well into some of your professional ethos, if you will, your professional value and ethics and all of that. The difference is, while your professional ethics might be general and broad, coach-responsive teaching take those general ideas and contextualize them or translate them to specifically named populations. Okay? So when you say, for example, start with where children are first, scaffold, then coach-responsive teaching says, yeah, let's scaffold. But you might say, let's scaffold all children. Coach-responsive teaching specifies which populations they're talking about. So we will say scaffold for African American, for Asian American, for Native American populations, and here are some of the things that you need to know about them in order to scaffold. Another kind of notion is that in all of this kind of stuff, with the language itself reveals a critical meaning, and that is what responsive teaching says is that those three things are interactive. Culture is always there. In order to teach, you have to respond to the cultural frames or references of the kids and what you're doing. In order to do that, you have to know the culture. And this will sometimes be very difficult because the notion of culture is so contaminated in the United States. One of the contaminations is that culture, for some reason here recently, or maybe I'm just going to hear it, in the last few years, I've been disgustedly fascinated with how often culture is associated with negative kinds of things. People are talking about the culture of violence. Let's say crime in the streets or gang activity, the culture of gangs. And I'm wondering, why are we associating culture with something negative? I don't understand what that's about. But if we go that way, since we as teachers don't want to perpetuate negative stuff, then we're going to avoid culture. The other thing that's been slipping back into our language that's counterproductive to culture-responsive teaching is, well, let's deal with all kids. That's what's got us in the trouble we're in. Unnamed all kids. Just kind of think about it. Now, if some of you must be parents. If someone were to call your child an all child, you know, the first thing you would jump over is that my child's name is da 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 da. You know, so if you're going to demand that for your own kids, why not? Why would you do that with your students? To all kids, to refer to these students as all students, perpetuates an invisibility that cultural responsive teaching says we've got to stop ignoring the features and the characteristics and the legacies and the heritage of kids. That should be a part of who they are as we deal with them within the classroom. So that, and the other thing that's crept into the language that's problematic for us in this area, and I say this is to say what cultural responsive teaching is not. Usually cultural responsive teaching will specify which kind of diversity we're concerned about. But what has crept in the language here lately is diversity without inequalities. So it's this, we're going to deal with diversity. If you read the scholarship in cultural responsive teaching, we don't talk that way. We say you're going to deal, which we might spring out of this, ethnic, racial, cultural, linguistic, social, gender diversity, you know, kind of stuff. Invariably, my points of reference are race, culture, and ethnicity. So anytime I say diversity, it's going to be racial, ethnic, and cultural diversity. I'm not going to deal with this diversity up there because that's too nebulous. And what it will do is people can do a whole lot of stuff around diversity, never touch dealing with kids of color who are not performing well in school, and will say, well, I'm doing diversity. Because folks can say, well, you know, like, I can talk about diversity of body type. You know, like, and I can talk about diversity of ability, and I can diversity of residence. All of those are diversities, but they're not dealing with what we're supposed to be doing here. If you're saying you're doing something in the name of cultural responsive teaching, if you're doing something else, then they'll call it cultural responsive teaching. Okay. So those are some of the kind of sort of misnomers. Cultural responsive teaching is built on a set of beliefs or assumptions. And I think that it's important that we know what some of these are, because those beliefs and assumptions, in a sense, kind of undergird behaviors and practices. So then, moral of the message is that if we want to change practice, we have to know what's the driving beliefs and assumptions. Because if you change the practice without the underbedding assumptions, then what will happen is the practice will not prevail, or the practices will get co-opted back in a sense, because one of the notion of cultural responsive teaching is that beliefs always govern behavior. Whatever you believe as teachers, you're going to work to make sure it happens. And we do it almost automatically without even giving conscious thought to what we're doing. Now, that's not a new notion. That's a very old notion. And you, some of you have been around long enough that this was probably your primer reading when you were in college. Pygmalion in the classroom. Remember that? Those of you who don't remember, just say, or that's a historical document. But that was a classic notion of Pygmalion in the classroom. Now, Pygmalion in the classroom had nothing at all to do with African American and Native American kids. But the idea holds true. And basically, the Pygmalion in the classroom, without going into the whole thing, is what teachers were told something about kids. They believed that, and teachers acted in ways to affirm the belief. In other words, you get what you want. And we as teachers make sure that we do it. So even though a lot of times we may have some of these beliefs that we're not even conscious of, or we're not doing anything explicit, they're, as Claude Steele might say, they're just in the air. You know, and that's not mean that insignificant. They're in the air because they permeate everything that we do without us being conscious of what we're doing. I believe all students can learn. I believe students are and I'm talking about my graduate students. I genuinely believe all students can learn in imaginative and creative ways. So if I believe that, then my beliefs obligate me to teach in imaginative and creative ways to facilitate my students being imaginative and creative. Now, college students sometimes, they don't want to be imaginative and creative. All they want to do is roll out what they've done before. But you can't do that in my class. You know? I've had to kind of adjust that a little bit because, if you got somebody that just They've been away from their creative juices for so long that they have looked like they've dried up. So you have to help that. I just can't say that you're going to be creative and imaginative. I've got to work in facilitative ways to assist that process. I believe that, so I go after it in all of my teaching, which means I have to be imaginative and creative in my teaching. And I think, well, I don't want to say that. I am, not all the time, but some of the time, some of the times are crucial. So beliefs govern behavior. Now, in order to do cultural responsive teaching, if you're going to translate that idea into action, one place to begin is to look at some of the beliefs that we have about children of color that are part of the legacy of schooling in the United States and see how those might be counterproductive to moving things forward. One of them is, I think, one of the most devastating codified beliefs that came on board in our profession was the notion of at risk. Kids are at risk. And we ran with that, and we did all of these kind of, quote, compensation things. The at-risk generation was no different from the predecessor generation of culturally deprived and compensatory education. Now, some of you might not know that, but that would have been in the 60s. Compensatory education would have been in the late 60s, early 70s. And then at-risk came in the 80s, the mid-80s or so, into the 90s. Fundamentally, it was no different. But how would you feel if everybody looked at you and said you at risk? And I mean, what were you at risk? You ain't got no daddies at home? Well, that's debatable. I think that at least we have some record, and some people would debate that, of one immaculate conception. So there's a daddy somewhere, right? Your mama ain't home when you get home. In that case, then doctors are some of the kids are the most at-risk kids there are. But isn't it curious that the doctor's kids were not dubbed at risk? Just because you got a nanny or somebody to open the door for you, your mom and daddy at home, if they're doctors. Lawyers, high-risk kids by their standard, because lawyers have to put in those billable hours, and that's not a 9-to-5 routine. But because poor people did not have somebody to surrogate for them to be there when their kids got home, then their kids got to be the carriers of the negative of that risk. Now, I don't have kids, but I'm telling you, if I were a parent and had a child in your school, and you come up on me talking about my child, my little black boy or girl is at risk, I'd take you out too. And I'm a professional colleague. I'd jump straight on you real quick. Because this little person might be a demon, but that's my demon. And I have not given you the prerogative. Now, black folks will give you privileges as a fixed family member, but I ain't giving you that privilege. Fixed means, kind of like you're a family member, even though you're not blood. So you can do what I do to my kid. I can give you that. So if I'm going to take my kid out, I haven't given you that right to do it. So of course I'm going to protect my kid. You would do the same thing. So what makes us think is that you're going to stand in defense of your child when you feel that they are being dishonored, that other parents would not do the same for theirs. Then the first thing we go, well, they're so hostile. You created the hostility. So, watch those beliefs and figure out what they are. So what I'm suggesting here is that there are systemic beliefs that are to the negative consequence of what we try to do, and there are also individual beliefs. And I think it's incumbent upon us, as your first step, and one of the first steps in doing cultural responsive teaching, is to know what those beliefs are, to face them, and to struggle at trying to contain them, control them, and eventually to replace them. Another belief. These parents of color, their kids are not performing well in school because they just don't value education. They don't care about education. I'm asking my students now, in this era of database decision making, I'm asking my students, where's your data for that? And I'd love to, in one class where I teach African American students and culture, I'd love to use the example, these little kindergartners and first grade black children. I hope I'm being cursing in front of your baby. Oh, good. Oh, you would have been up on me like, that's my grandbaby. Your mouth. Oh, because sometimes I have a bad vocabulary of 3 curse words, and sometimes I do that.
We heard you before.
She probably go home and say, Granny, that woman said that. But anyway, so I'll have to kind of
To use
do
the
some
same
editing
words
along
as
the
you,
way.
Granny.
So one of the things that I like to do is one of these,
Yeah.
one of these classic things of African American first graders and kindergartners, they are behind in reading because they do not have text-rich home environments, and their parents don't tell them bedtime stories and all of that. And I want to know how you know that. How does one know that? But that's a common kind of assumption that's still being floated around. Now, I might be wrong. I don't believe I am, but I don't believe black folks will have you up in their house when they put their babies to bed. It ain't gonna happen. So where's that coming from? It's nothing but mythology that's been created. And the other kind of thing is what makes you think, when we talk about reading, I know a thing about reading, but none of that. I know a couple of things, but not a whole lot. But what makes us assume that in order to teach reading as recognizing words in written text, that the only prelude to that is written text? Can't people read visually? Can't they read verbally? If you don't think that, let's say as an example, I'm using just as an example now, look like kids can't read visually. Drive down the street past a McDonald's. 2 years old. There's no way you don't know what they're saying, but they'll let you know that if you pass by, you don't pull in. Like, where you think you're going? You got to go here. Stop by Target or Toys R Us. Just ride by. They know that, So there are a lot of ways to read, not just by the words on a page, Another kind of, and children are taught this. It's not sitting down in families and saying, I'm now teaching you these things. They're taught through example. Let me reach back for a historical example. I grew up with my grandmother. My grandmother had 3 years of formal education. So by all about our standards, she would be illiterate. But that woman could read human beings, And little kids can read human behavior. They will tell you, just out teachers. And the funny thing about it is they be telling the truth. They might say, well, that teacher mean. You say, why are you telling these tales? You never even been with that teacher. She mean or he mean. And then you kind of slide up and hang around. Where that child learn to know that? 5 years old. All that kind of stuff. By the time they're 6, that teacher over there, she don't like black people. Like, girl, get away from me. That's where a black teacher might say, get away from me. Stop telling those tales. And then you say, let me check this out here. And there is truth to the matter. There is something about kids that can glean insightful information by the nuances of behavior. That is a form of reading. When you read a text, if it has any worthwhile value, you pick up a book to read, it's something about, very often it'll be some variation of somebody's behavior, nuanced, but in verbal text. So why couldn't that kind of reading be a prelude and a foundation for attaching words to symbolic behaviors and all of that? Words, that's all words are. They're symbolisms of some kind of embedded or implied behavior. Well, anyway, so that kind of belief type stuff is there. It's just not there, And but I think part of the thing that happened is that many culturally different people, all of us, we code ideas and behaviors in language, real and symbolic. And if the coding of these behaviors and attitudes and values and beliefs, if our kids and their parents code in one way and their code or cueing mechanisms don't fit ours, then we therefore assume that the behavior, the value, is not there. So, but if you know something about African American culture, it shouldn't be surprising that many black parents may not be reading to their children at bedtime, because conventional black culture is an oral culture. So rather than reading from text, we tell stories. We tell oral stories. The other thing is it is a communal culture, so it may not just be the parents telling the kids the bedtime stories. It could be an older sibling, or one of those, play mamas and cousins and all of that kind of stuff. They're not really family members, but to make it simplified, we just said that's my play aunt and my play uncle and that kind of stuff. They be in the household, and mama might be preparing for school the next day, so you say, tell my put my baby to bed. In other words, tell him or her a story. And if you were in the family and did not know those cultural dynamics when that was happening, you'd miss all of that because the cueing is out of sync. And you would assume is that, I wonder why that parent didn't do that herself or himself. Why shouldn't I do it when that is an extension of me, that other person? They're doing as I would do. And that's what an extended, or what people would say is that African American family structure is an augmented structure. That means that it includes biological members and associated members through friendship and all of that kind of stuff. So that's kind of a couple examples of beliefs govern behavior. How are we doing on time? I just talk. I don't pay any attention to the clock. I can keep on going. I think the next kind of a notion that undergoes cultural responsive teaching, I've already talked about it a lot. So I'll just kind of give name to it, and that is that culture counts fundamentally and profoundly in all dimensions of the teaching learning process. There literally is nothing that we do in the name of education that is not impacted by somebody's culture. The problem is it's not impacted by enough bodies' culture. The fact that not this one, your chair. How do you suppose that this chair got sized? This size of chair was normed after somebody. Now, we need to ask the question was, who was the norm? If you look at, just for an example, don't take me too serious on this one, but it might not be, if you look at so-called average size of Chinese ancestry people, this would not be an adequately normed chair, because more than likely, the greater number of Chinese people, given their stature, are likely to be vertically not as large as us. As us meaning people in the United States. So is this, and the other kind of thing is that, why is this a universal chair? Do kindergartens have little versions of this? Or they have to sit in these big old chairs?
This is the children's version of this chair. The adult chairs are over in the family.
Yeah. But which children? Are they 5 years old, 6 years old? Are they black kids? Are they brown kids? Are they white kids?
I think the assumption is that they are children between the ages of kindergarten.
And the assumption is that there are children between those ages, and the assumption that all children between those ages would be pretty much the same size. That's debatable. Just absolutely debatable. Because a 6-year-old, let's say, Taiwanese girl, if she is given what most Taiwanese might look like, is likely to be shorter in stature than a 6-year-old European American or an African American. People in the United States are the biggest people in the world. This way and that way. So we're sitting up in here, norming these chairs after this American person, but we have all these kids coming from, in your schools, coming from around the world. It's a kind of sort of a silly example, but to try to make a point that why do you suppose that we line kids up? One of the things that you as kindergartners do is that you teach kids how to be conformists to institutional pressure. And I'm not making any value judgment on it. That's part of your agenda. And part of that lining up is that they have to begin to learn to regulate their body functions. And then if they don't regulate their body function, then let's say they have a little accident, there are all kinds of things where pressures about, are you sure you're big enough to be coming to big people's school when you're having these little accidents? And we don't even have to do it as adults. It's already embedded in students. Oh, teacher, he peed. Because he was supposed to wait for 15 more minutes before bath time. He wasn't, because his body said he needed to urinate now. He wasn't supposed to do that. After all, he's in school. He's supposed to control your life. Why do you suppose that kids line up to go back for you to move them back and forth between them? It's not because the line, every culture has a unit of organization, but the line is not universal. Curiously enough, all of the cluster groups of color in the United States have a circle as the primary unit of organization. So when your little black kids and your little brown kids have a hard time keeping their line straight, it might be simply that they just doing their thing, their cultural thing, because they move about and they position themselves as human in interaction with physical space, not in a linear way, but in a circular way. And curiously enough, even further, that inclination will hold true as they think, as they relate, and as they write, and as they speak. So now, the kindergartners, they don't have nothing to say anyway, so I don't know about them. You know I'm playing with you with that. These little kids they gabbing all the time. But let's say you give them some slack, but by the time they're fourth grade, they're supposed to be able to speak academically. And little black kids, and they into kind of tell you what they know and all that kind of stuff, and you say, get to the point. When you gonna get to the point, James? You look up like, what's your problem? I'm on the point. Because what you're hearing is he's roaming and rambling all over the place. That might be among your colleagues, by the way. You know, you might be sitting there saying, I sure wish this black woman would either get to the point or shut up. Because I don't know what she's doing, you know, kind of. But you play it off, you know, kind of stuff like that. All of those are cultural dynamics in play. And if you don't understand those cultural dynamics, first of all, you'll misdiagnose it. And then when you try to intervene to help students, if you will, for the sake of a better term, to style shift or code shift from one way of being into another way of being, because you misdiagnose, you mistreat. And then everything, you know, just kind of go down the toilet from that place to that place and all that kind of stuff. Because in some ways, your good intended effort to help your kids perform better, because they have not been filtered through cultural sensitivity and cultural diagnosis, ends up aggravating the situation than trying to resolve the situation. There are some colleagues of mine who have been doing some studies on African American disciplinary referral, African American student disciplinary referral. And one of the things that they found is that sometimes teachers aggravate the disciplinary problem rather than resolving it because of cultural misunderstanding. And what they found further is that the black kids would not argue with the teacher about whether they committed the infraction to be disciplined, but their argument was their right to be heard. So teachers say, I saw you doing it, be quiet, you got this punishment. And the kids won't argue with that the punishment or to be indicted for misbehavior, but they demand the right for their side to be heard. And when the teacher said, I don't want to hear it, I saw it. The kids are going to argue with the teacher. And then the tension get more and more and all of that. And these little people can be stubborn, you know, and in some ways rightfully so. But again, if you don't know all of that, on that plane, you can't do adequate cultural responsive teaching. Another thing that might happen, I keep using African Americans as a case example because I know that population better than some of the others. Not that there are some other variation from other ethnic groups. If you know about the cultural styles of communicating as well as cultural styles of relating, that puts you in a better position to do whatever you want to do. Even if you want to when you want to punish kids, you can do it more effectively. As well as if you want to praise them and to facilitate and assist them. All of that can be better because you're culturally informed. And how you behave can fit. You can make it a better fit with where the kids' frames of reference are about. Have you ever been in a situation where you're trying to compliment a student and you do it in front of the class? Sammy was just so good. We should all just applaud. We should celebrate Sammy because he's so good. And he did so well on this task, and you have done all of your little nice grading on it, and you pass Sammy's paper back to you, and in front of your face, he was all the way to the class. I like to do a little dramatic piece. That was pulled in the trash can, so I missed my point on that one. My spot. As a high school teacher, before I knew this, and teaching black students, that would bug me to death. I had done all of this work to try to compliment and to give constructive feedback and all of that. And the response was to ball the paper up and throw it in the trash can in front of my face was a rejection of I read it as a rejection of my effort. Because at that point I didn't know my own cultural proclivities or my students and all of that. The problem with that was that I violated the cultural taboo. I pulled the kid out of the context of the group and appraised the individual. And African Americans are group-based people. You don't do that because it puts the individual in tension with the group. So if I had begun with somehow or other complimenting the group, if the group was nothing more than that one student to say that, this student, this student, this student did this, because then it's a recreation of a facsimile of group, I would have had a better chance. But I put the student out there, and he had to save face. So in an attempt to compliment, I ended up embarrassing public. A lot of that comes from that. And as teachers, we're human beings too. We've done all this work and we're trying to do something and we get rejected. You want to push back too. But just kind of remember, in these classrooms, if you got 20 of them, 1 against 20, you can't win. They might be little, but they're mighty. Kind of stuff is that, if nothing more is that you lose face, you try to pull something down and, kind of, step out there and like, I can deal. The rest of the kids say, ooh, look what that teacher said to him or her. Then this little brown kid in the background said, I got to protect my rep here. So they got to come back at you. And then what you thought was you were taking care of one disciplinary issue, and it's just aggravated. Now the whole class is in an uproar. They're giggling, and they're giggling, they're laughing, and they're oohing, and then they're talking to each other about all this kind of stuff, and you sitting there as a teacher like, what happened? I lost control. You kind of stuff. Because you tried to take on 20 kids. You can't do that. Not publicly. In front of an audience, because some kids will perform for an audience. That's the nature of their cultural socialization. If you're not ready to perform, then don't do that. Find another way to get to that kid so that you isolate the kid from the audience. But you don't play in front of the audience, because then all you're doing is you're stimulating for the audience to play their part, kind of stuff. I would love to be in some of your rooms sometime. I bet I would have great material. But then I would try to help you.
Come visit anytime.
I'll try to help you out. Let me say a couple more things, and then see if I should stop talking a bit and see if you have some questions and all that. There's another kind of a notion or an idea, sort of a premise of cultural responsive teaching, and that is always affirm before you perform. Always try to affirm. In other words, find something to validate and praise a kid before you ask them to change, to try something new. That's basically, it's a human principle, but it works so well here. Now, that does not mean that that everything that your children of color do, that you should just say, well, it's their culture, and then you do that. That's an abdication of responsibility. But there are some things that kids can do. What you're looking for is that I want to build a foundation of trust and a foundation of respect. So then when I need to push kids beyond that, I've got that to fall back on. And one way in which I can do this is to make sure that I affirm kids, that I compliment, that I praise, and then try to build them to the point that they can go into this kind of stuff. Because if for no other reason, learning is very high risk. It takes courage to learn, to try something you haven't tried before, when you don't know whether or not. And that's for you as well as for the students. So in some ways, cultural responsive teaching is very courageous. Now, as they say, if you're the weak of heart, and one way the weak of heart is that if you got to have everything prescripted before you do it, you ain't ready. You because a lot of what we're talking about is a venture into experimentation and trying something that hasn't been tried before. You know, but you've got a lot of things to fall back on. You know, you've got some professional anchors and all of this, but you have to do it. The other kind of thing I would say, as far as a principle, a general idea or an undergirding assumption, and then I want to suggest a couple of other kinds of guideposts for you. And that is, culturally responsive teaching demands plurality. If you're looking for that one best practice that's going to be applicable and appropriate and effective, forget it. Ain't going to happen. That's not even the nature of teaching. It's a waste of your resources to be looking for it. And it most certainly, when you add to the mixture all of the different kind of ethnic and racial and cultural and experiential backgrounds of your students, and you're looking for one strategy that's going to work for everybody, I think what happens is that we have to flip that upside down and grow ourselves to the point where we accept plurality and variability as the normative ways of standard everyday features of our teaching. So you should try to get yourself to the point where you never teach anything in your class by using one approach. Never, ever. Because that one approach is likely to be only for you. And there may be a few kids that can buy into it. But the more ways you can use to teach the same thing, the greater is the likelihood that you will touch and succeed with more students. And of course, as you try different kinds of ways of teaching that same thing, there's some cultural guidelines and cultural frames of reference that will help you to anchor those kinds of things. Just kind of sort of quick formalistic way to try to imagine that is, think about it is that your example should always, what you're trying to teach, your techniques you're trying to teach, they should always be multicultural or multi-ethnic. So, I mean, just if you have to begin by training yourself with a quota system, then don't be shy about that. Like, I got me a white example, I need me a black example, and I need me another example. Code them. Record them. You know, you have to start training sometime, some way. There's nothing wrong with that. Because what you're going to do is that you will eventually develop the skill of doing it, and it becomes habitual. You don't need that. And then it will happen automatically. That's when you know you're really moving ahead on your professionalism in general, you know. So put that down. Another way you can do is always start with home base, whatever, and you define what home base means, but never stop at home base. Now, home base could be you. Because culturally responsive teachers is not saying to the teacher that you eliminate yourself from the formula. So home base could be you. I mean, you know yourself better than anybody else. But at least let kids know is that this is an example that's coming from my background, rather than this is a strategy or an example that's supposed to be from on high. You know, kind of stuff is that. This is mine. But never stop at home base. So then you add as many pluses, another example and another example as you're ready and your student is ready to go. Try to never stop with less than 3. And sometimes you might have to do. And the other kind of thing is that when you're giving strategies that are kind of governed or driven or centered into different kind of ethnicities, try to never get into the habit of using the same sequential order that you use the strategy. Because we know in mainstream U.S. mentality, what comes first is implied to be most significant. So let's say if you're European American and you always start with European American examples, then implicitly you're saying that European American is more important than others. So shift them around and all that. So you see how you have to train yourself and you have to learn how to monitor and manage your own process in your teaching and learning. Okay, so we can talk more about that later or some other time. So what are some of so those are some of the implicit kind of notions. What are some of the sort of framework brackets around this thing called culturally responsive teaching? And by these, what I mean are some principles for action, because you need to have some fence posts. I try to think in metaphors. You need some fence posts so that what you are doing in the name of culturally responsive teaching fall within the framework of culturally responsive teaching. But it's not something that you're doing that may be fine, but it's outside the framework, but you're claiming it as culturally responsive. Right? One of them is culture responsive teaching is about building bridges, you building bridges to help students cross cultural boundaries. When your kids of color, when your poor white kids come to school, many of them on a day-to-day basis are having to negotiate multiple cultural systems almost consistently in the student process, because mainstream schooling is embedded in middle-class Eurocentrism. So even poor white kids got a problem there. So they're having to go back and forth between these cultural frames of reference. It might be, for some kids, they may be not participating orally as much in your class as you would like, because they might be in the process of trying to edit their language. You know, they're trying to figure out, they're little smart people anyway, so they're trying to figure out someplace in their little minds, I don't mean diminutive, but it's probably smaller than yours. In other words, you got a wrong big head. And they got little people heads, you know, kids' heads, so the brain is still growing. So they may be trying to figure out, now I know I'm not supposed to talk this way in school, and they're trying to figure out how to find the right way to talk in school before they talk. So therefore they don't get to talk, because they're constantly doing that kind of stuff. Then when they get it, so they got to get ready. They're now in school, but they're not really in school yet because their heads are not on school, right? You know, all that kind of stuff. And they finally get it in the midst of the reading lesson. And by the time that they have arrived for reading, the reading lesson is over. And what do you do as teachers? You say, oh, okay, students, put your reading books away. Get ready. You probably have a cueing mechanism for transition and how you shift from one area to another. Next is coming up math, so do your 1, 2, 3, look at me kind of stuff, stand up and kick your feet three times or whatever you do. And as soon as you do that, guess what happens to the kids?
Or back to square one.
Exactly. They return to their cultural base. But reading starts, math now starts, and we as teachers don't give any time for them to make the transition. We just go, okay, ding dong, we make transition, math starts, and we go right into the heart of math instruction. Kids not with us. Because they went at rest during the transition from one area of instruction to another, and they got to now come back to school again. The question is, how long does it take, you wonder, where kids get worn out of making those transitions with nobody helping them do it? And at some point, imagine the ones that are not successfully getting over, making the border crossing. By the time they get to take the reading is now over by 15 minutes. Then they got to do math. They're like to fall even further behind trying to get to math. By the time they get ready to do math, it's over by 30 minutes. Well, how long is it going to be for kids to forget that? You know, I can't do it anymore. And since they're those active, incredibly beautiful minds, if they are not on your schedule, these minds cannot be idle. So guess what they do? The minds have to be engaged. So they engage themselves. The only problem is you and they have different agendas. It's not that these are little evil beings. They're just simply very vital, curious, intellectual, little human beings whose minds have to be engaged. And if you don't engage them, if you leave them behind, then they will engage themselves. And isn't it so fascinating? We talk all so glibly about no child left behind, and how stylized that becomes, and where the heart of the matter really is, none of those policymakers ever reach there. So building bridges and that kind of stuff. So the question for you as a culture responsive teacher is, what constitutes the building the bridges? Of course, the bridge is a metaphor, but how do you help your students transition across these different cultural ways of being, and most certainly so that they can also transition back? Because you don't want to be in a situation where you have children from different cultural backgrounds, and you say, this is the way you function in school, and you deny them a return to their home base, because they have to go home. Because if you do, then you run the risk of creating marginal beings, and they don't fit back at home, and that becomes a problem. Because school is not the place for most of us to be normal. It's a contrived environment that requires special kinds of behaviors. And when school is over, we go back into our repertoire and reclaim those behaviors that function and ways of being that function outside of school, and we take those back on. So we are always crossing cultural borders too. You know that. When school is, it might take you, depending on how much you invested in school, it might take you anywhere from a hot minute to an hour to make that transition. But you can't be at home the way you are at school. If you are really a boring person. Because the two just don't work. I tell my students is that if you kind of make your hook up, and you operate the way with this potential mate that you're trying to approach, the way you in a classroom, that's the reason why you make this. But then I have to think maybe I'm making this so much. Maybe that's my problem. I take my own lessons. Not quite. Okay. Another one is that the language of academics. Teach kids language, words, are powerful devices in all kinds of ways. And a lot of kids may not be performing well in your classes because they don't understand the language of the various skill areas that you're working in. So they can't get the meaning if they don't know the words. So do you habitually stop and teach kids the vocabulary of the various skill areas, the vocabulary of reading, before you ask them to try to develop the skill of reading? Because if we don't do that, what you're going to do is as you work through teaching the skill of reading, you're going to be using the vocabulary, the technical vocabulary. We might call it, there's a variant of what some people call academic language. But then a lot of people, when they talk about academic language, it's this amorphous thing that they decontextualize it and separate it from particular subject or skill areas, and you still don't know what you're floating around with. But do you do that as part of this? Or do you teach kids the essence of what you want them to know, the skill, before you introduce the academic language? That's the kind of thing that Bob Moses has been doing for middle school kids and teaching them mathematics by having them understand what is the mathematic operation and skill before they are introduced to the mathematics language and all of that. So they have a, if you will, competency base as a launch for when they have to try to understand the formal language and all. So in other words, they have something to fall back on. So that's kind of one thing. Another thing you might want to think about is code shifting. In this case now, linguistic shifting. Can you teach kids how to shift their codes for their thoughts and their expressions so that they can use kinds of codes in different kinds of settings? In the classroom, and not just in the classroom generally, but depending on what is happening in the classroom as the dynamics of the classroom unfold. And how to shift out of that language for when they're on the playground so that they can be very effective functioners on the playground. They're not little nerds sitting in the corner and they have no playmates, kind of stuff, because they don't know how to talk to a playmate and all that. And how to, sometimes we do some of that, or we at least would say, well, that's not the way to talk to an adult. But then do we teach them how to talk to that adult? My rule for this is that never take a word or a phrase from a child that you do not stand in readiness to provide an alternative. Because if you do that, most of us, including your students, do not use words idly. We use words in language because it serves purposes, specified purposes. And whatever language kids are using is serving some kind of purpose. If you think the language is inappropriate and you don't provide them with an alternative, I guarantee you they will revert to using the language that you thought you were told not to. And what you'll be doing, like, didn't I tell you not to say that? How many times did I tell you that? You can't use that in my language, in my classroom. And you're just wearing yourself out. Because 5 days later, they use it again. And then you probably think, I know this child. I didn't want to do it, but I'm going to have to consider referring them. No drama here. Okay. We've talked about strengths-based learning. There's another kind of thing is that cultural responsive teaching that is a bracket for you, and that is building what people talk about communities of practice among your students. In other words, building an ethos, a sense, an ambiance in the classroom is that we're in this classroom and we are obligated to help each other learn. And that's just not me, the teacher, helping you learn, but students, you got to help each other learn. And our learning agenda has not been finished until everybody in this classroom is learning and everybody's helping everybody else learn. Because learning never occurs alone. We say in mainstream culture, the priority is on individuals learning, but even individuals who think that they're learning alone, it never happens. Never. Because if you say, well, I have to learn this text, somebody provided you with the text. So right away, that means you're not learning alone. There are all kinds of things where that. And learning is always better when it's collaborative. You know, when you put multiple minds together, you get better output than a single mind. You know, I love my mind, but sometimes it just gets exhausted. You know, and then I have to hang out with some other people to replenish my intellectual repertoire and all of that are possibilities because they stimulate my mind. But the same thing with little kids, you know. So, whether it's positive or negative. If you know, with the age group you work with, sometimes when they really are being little beasties, when you put them with 3 or 4 get together, they are really out of control. One of them, you like my goodness. First of all, they jabbering all the time at once, and you can't, who's saying what? All this kind of stuff. They probably ganged up against you anyway. They knew that you couldn't manage that because if nothing else, they're children of multi-stimulation simultaneously. It's those of us, like you and I, that we have to say, let me do one thing at a time. Let me listen to you, and then I'll talk to you after I listen. That's boring. These kids do all that at once. You know, and they literally can listen to five of them at once and tell you what was going on. It's just us that we won't do it. And we say, stop it. I can't, all of you can't talk at once. Yes, they can. It's just that you can't figure out what they're talking about. That's your problem. So I'm going to change that. Okay, now, there are many other things that we need to be done and can be done. But let me stop there and see if you kind of begin to get a feel. And part of the feel is to begin to find some spaces and places within this domain of cultural responsive teaching that you can claim as your entry points. And the rule of thumb is, as you will do with your students, you will also want to do with yourself. Always start with strength, not with weakness. So as a teacher, a multi-subject teacher, if you know you're not good at math, you pray to all the gods and goddesses to help you out when you have to teach math. Then you're setting yourself up for failure in cultural responsive teaching. You're not good at cultural responsive teaching yet. You're just starting. You're not good at math, so you put 2 negatives together. The only time that makes a positive is in algebra. In real life, I have to kind of slam my math friends here. In real life, two negatives don't get a positive. So what you want to do is you want to create a potential, ideally you want a win-win situation. So strength leads further strength. Minimally, you want to create a situation where potentially win-lose. So you start at strength, you add a cultural responsive feature, and if cultural responsive feature doesn't work, then at least the first time out, you know that that thing that you're good at already. Now, some of you, your best thing would be creating a physical environment that's an extension of your teaching. You know how to decorate a room, and those decorations are not just because they're cute, but they're extensions of your teaching. If that's what your strength is, then do cultural responsive teaching through the physical decoration of your room. Some of the rest of you, you know you can't decorate a room, so why are you up in there trying? I mean, what you put up is nothing but crap, junk. Your colleagues walk by your room and say, ew. They don't tell you, they kind of smile. But they do. They talk about you behind your back, like that was some mess up in there, putting that mess in the front of kids. Then don't go there. You know, if you know that in reading, vocabulary is your thing, but what is it then? Interpretation is not, because you can't figure out what the mess means either. But you can really whip it when it comes to vocabulary. Then you start cultural responsive teaching within your vocabulary lessons, not in your interpretation or your comprehension lesson. And the whole idea is that with you and with your students, you want to start at strength and work in the direction of weakness, knowing full well if good teaching and learning works as it should, in the process of engaging, we develop yet other competencies. So that when you reach what you thought initially was a point of weakness, you have built strength along the way, it's no longer weakness. So that's the idea of using something from outside of the classroom teaching to apply to teaching. And that is equivalent in cultural responsive teaching of what other people mean about building capacity. But in this case, it's building your instructional capacity, whereas very often we use that concept to talk about a system building capacity. That's fine. If it works for them too, we can make it work for us as well. Okay? Is that enough for now? What do you think?
What do you want to do?
While you think about, you have to think fast because I just keep on talking. Let me mention a couple things on your question list. And maybe this will help us with transition a little bit. There's a question about what resources that to get content about ethnic groups. That's both one of the dilemmas that you're going to have is you have to ask yourself what kind of content are you looking for, because there is all different kinds of content. The other thing is that very often the content will be ethnic specific. So you might not be able to find content sources where there are a lot of different ethnic groups in one place. And so you may have to lug around a bunch of books, if you will. So that can be a bit of a disadvantage, but don't let it discourage you. The encouraging part is there is a tremendous amount of information available about ethnic groups now. So if anything, you'll be inundated with information. While I'm not a strong fan of the internet and technology, it can, Google is amazing. You just kind of put in what you think you might have thought about once for some help, and Google will tell you that, of course, you do mean this, don't you? And you can get help there. There is, rule of thumb is that if you're trying to find something that might have a lot of different kinds of elements of culture and contributions embedded within it, there is some persuasive arguments is to use ethnic people's literature with the idea that people tend to write about, in literary form, write about things that are important to them. And you can find all kinds of things, whether it's identity, whether it's contribution, whether it's historical memory, all of those kinds of things could be in literary tradition. And the beautiful thing about it is one of the areas of the greatest amount of growth in ethnic literature is in children's literature, kind of stuff. And even if you do pre-readers, picture books, that's for up to 5 years old, there's nothing wrong with a fifth grader reading a picture book. I have my college students reading picture books. We just did a project where they had to analyze a picture book, kind of stuff like that. So you can do those kinds of things. I would say for now, beware of asking and expecting kids to be experts on their own cultures and to tell you about that culture thing, because they may live their culture but not necessarily know cognitively their culture. Just because you're in it, doesn't automatically mean you can articulate it. There is, if you want some historical stuff, if you want one source to give you a historical backdrop, it's probably a book called, the title is A Different Mirror. And it's written by Ron Takaki. Beautiful book, and it's written, even though it was a Japanese ancestry, he does not restrict that text to just a Japanese experience. He really is talking about different ethnic groups and their contributions to the construction of the United States. in the making of a country.
This other book, Strangers from a Different Shore.
From a different shore as well. There, he has several books. My first choice of those would be A Different Mirror, but you don't have to stop there. So those are a couple of kinds of things. I know, just because of what I've been doing, I know of children's books. I know African American authors better than others. One of my favorite African American authors, children's books, because you find a lot of cultural nuances in her writing, is Florence McKissick. And one book that has been helpful for me that she wrote is Flossie and the Fox. It's a black variation on Little Red Riding Hood. And I love it because you see Flossie, the character, engaging in a lot of cultural nuances. And one of them is that how Flossie uses language. I mean, she just really, she signifies on the fox.
Yes, she does.
Now, you would have to know what that means, but basically, the fox jumps strong like I'm the big bad character in this, after all. I'm going to eat up your grandma and all that kind of stuff. And Flossie just messed with him and like, are you sure you're a fox?
Yeah.
And then the fox gets to be a tad concerned because he has to persuade her that, and then along the way he gets uncertain about his own certainty. Because he says, well, I have a bushy tail. So she tells him about some other animals that have a bushy tail. I have long, sharp teeth. So she tells him about some other foxes that have long, sharp teeth. The whole notion is the fox, she is playing the fox, manipulating the fox to protect herself. And by the time that the fox is totally confused, she just skips off and goes on about her business. And the fox is just left wondering, what am I? Bless his heart. I think it's so cute. There is another, I just ran across a recent book. It's authored by Debbie Allen, the actress. And the title of it is Dancers of the Night. I'm sorry, Brothers of the Night. And again, you can see how Allen, as the author, uses language. And basically, it's a story of 12 brothers. And they sneak out at night because they like to dance, and their daddy is a minister. And there are a lot of these sort of cultural conflicts. I mean, we were in traditional African American culture. We always think that the preacher's kids, have to be so la-di-da, And they think they have to be la-di-da too, because these brothers they think they have to sneak out after daddy is asleep in order to go dancing and all that. But one of the fun things about it, the story is told by the dog. The dog is the narrator, and there is the dog is telling the story, and then he tells their story and his story too. Is that the dancer shoes get eaten up, and along the way the dog says, of course they blamed it on me, just because I'm a dog. I did not eat those shoes and all this kind of stuff. So you get this kind of sort of a discourse in the midst of the telling of the story, even though the dog is the only one talking in the telling the story, and later on some characters too. But it's a playful and beautiful way to introduce you to some of the dynamics of African American communication. And you might see some of those dynamics in your classroom, because sometimes kids will engage with you in similar kinds of ways. And I still say that when a teacher really moves black students to intellectual action, you're going to get physiological and emotional engaging as well. So you will have black kids, oh, teacher, I know the answer. You're like, what's your problem? Why are you talking out? I told you to just raise your hand and be quiet until I call on you. And they might say, I forgot, but raise your hand as I can next door, like, I hope she'll call on me soon because I really got this one down, And you wonder, like, child, you better get with the program. But that's not terribly uncommon in African American communication style, and the culture has over time learned to accommodate those kinds of things. Here's a question that really is not so much about post-responsive teaching, but it's on the Common Core standard. That is this just a new smoke screen for doing nothing to open the doors to historically disenfranchised. All I can say is hallelujah. The reason why I would say that is that there is nothing wrong with having standards, and coach-responsive teaching is not in tension with standards at all. The problem, though, is with the standards, with the Common Core, and with any other standard, when you say that there's only one way to demonstrate mastery, that's what becomes problematic. Or the only way to get to one way to get to mastery. Simply because, as I've said several times already, that kids learn in different ways, under different circumstances. And the other kind of thing is that all kids are not going to be able to be at the same level of proficiency. That just defies, human beings we're all over the place as far as our capabilities. And that doesn't mean that one is better than, we just have different repertoires of competencies. So what we should be looking for is getting each child to the highest level of his or her repertoire capabilities, not that we are all on the same one, because first of all, we're not likely to ever get everybody at the same level of performance. Or the only way we can get someone at the same level of performance is to lower the level so much that's nonsense. And then we should lower the level when it's mediocrity, but put it out there as it's quality. So it's a useless argument, So let's understand that the actual level of performance will vary, but as long as we can say is that each child is performing at his best level, that's what we're looking for out of that. I really would not want a whole lot of people running around being the same as me. Because, after a bit it would be boring. I might not love myself, but come on now.
I do.
More than one?
I tell the children that every day. I say, I don't care if you hate me, I love me.
Absolutely. And in that sense, that level of love as an indicator of performance and achievement, then your kids should be loving themselves in their own way of loving themselves. All up and down the line. Yeah. So now you've had a chance, you've heard me talk, you've heard me be playful. I tried to answer a question to give you some transition time. What are your questions?
Question. I'm pretty sure I read somewhere in your writings about making home visits.
Oh, okay.
So, I'm needing some real help. I haven't been invited anywhere in a long time. No birthday parties, no soccer games lately. Hence, help.
Oh, why are you waiting to be invited? Maybe you need to invite somebody.
Well, sometimes for people to just invite themselves somewhere, maybe you didn't want your teacher to see you playing soccer.
Yeah.
Maybe you didn't want your teacher watching you do this.
And again, I'm just being playful with that kind of response, even though there might be a message under the playfulness. I have some dilemmas around home visits, because it's not that I don't think what I assume to be the intent of home visit is not important. And if one of those assumptions is to make connections with family members in settings outside of school, then that needs to make sense for me. But I'm not so sure that we ought to take home visit as literal as we try to take it. And the reason why I say that is that let's look at what home means to people. And for me, for so many of the populations, the parents of our children that we're concerned about, home might be the last refuge from a lot of exploitation, oppression, pressure, anxiety, just living, if you will, the constraints and the demands of living in a racist society. Okay? So when those folks go home and they close the door, this might be their place of refuge. And for us to penetrate that, then we might be doing more damage than good. Because we may not like it, but in many instances, we symbolize a lot of those things that a lot of parents are struggling with on a daily basis. We might say we're poorly underpaid, but as professional educators, we are privileged. And we have opportunities and resources. And to come up into that last bastion of protection against, if you will, the enemy, to penetrate that, we might out people too much. And I wonder about some of the potential damages there. So the question becomes, can we find some alternative places to establish those kind of relationships? And if we're going to do home visits, if we want to, whatever we want to happen out of the home visits, I would argue is let's not start with a literal home visit. Let's grow the relationship to the point where we can go into somebody's home. Okay? Don't start there. Some cultural groups will, whatever their resources will be, if they know a distinguished guest is coming, and in their minds, teachers are distinguished in some way or not, they would do all kinds of things to prepare for your presence. Mm-hmm. And you still will not see normal, day-to-day, habitual kinds of behaviors. You're going to see the Sunday manners, if you will. I don't know why Sunday, that's a Christian thing, I think. Or maybe the Friday manners, or the Saturday manners. You have to throw in some other religious order. So you're still not getting what you're looking for and all of that. It may, in some cases, it might very well be if you think that you want to see how parents and guardians interact with the children that you have in your school. The children might not even be present. They may have been removed from the setting for the duration of your visit. So what are you getting accomplished? Nothing. So what I would say is that begin to build a relationship by meeting in different locations with whomever, with these parents and guardians. Don't always ask them to come to you, because then you're asking them to come into your house. And they may have real problems getting into your house. For a lot of the parents that we say we can't get come to school, schooling is a painful memory. And I was saying to the group earlier this morning, most people don't seek out pain. You know, I mean, some of us get off.
We won't admit to it.
But most people will avoid places of pain and sites that are memories of pain. So some of that might be doing. But what are some places between school and literal home? What are some other locations might we inhabit? And that's not to say that we won't at some point have these meetings at school and eventually have them in the literal home. But what about in between? There are some kind of other kinds, and to be conscientious and sensitive to the notion about how turf plays a role in relationships and building relationships. When I'm on my turf, I'm in control. And you come into my turf, you know, I mean, come on, you really are at a disadvantage. I mean, you may think you're in control, but you're not really. I might be messing with you, giving you, just running a corner, and you think you're getting authentic information. And I'm sitting, or my audience sitting in the other room just laughing. Like, oh, no, she didn't do that, set them up like that, you know. I mean, those are turf kinds of things. When we ask parents to come to school, that's our turf. We automatically put them at a disadvantage because they're not insiders into schooling. And the argument goes is that if you want to build constructive, genuine relationships, is they should be equal status. So it's best to you're likely to get closer to equal status by trying to find some in-between spaces to meet, rather than having the parents come to you and you going up into the parents' home. You know? And the other thing is that the home is that you should not be invited. You should not invite yourself into other people's homes. That's a place where you are to be invited. If you invite yourself, you should assume from the very beginning that that is not a genuine relationship, and you are not likely to get what you went looking for. But there may indeed come a time once after you've grown the relationship where you will genuinely get an invitation. And that's when you're going to get authentic information. By that time, people know you well. Little kids sitting up there, 8-year-old, ain't doing what they're going. Boy, if you don't get out here, I'm going to knock that black off you. And you'll know then, like, oh my God, I should rush out there. One because we got an abuse situation going on. You just kind of smile and feel like, you know, everything's copacetic. And you're going about your business. Because you got a baseline. So that's somewhat I would say about the home visits and all of that kind of stuff. And it might be, I mean, you may have to wait a while to get the genuine invitation. That's okay. You know, you're not special.
You know,
You can become, but you're not automatically special.
I had quite an extraordinary experience yesterday because the reception desk called and said, you know, I have a mother here who wants to visit, but I don't know what the rules are about children coming up as well. So, is that all right?
Yeah.
And there's a little infant in a pushchair, and the mother came in with some photographs, and they're recent refugees from Chad. And one of the things she introduced was that there may be more than one wife.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that got all the kids' attention.
Mm-hmm.
And then, without even blinking, she started breastfeeding the infant.
Mm-hmm.
And so that got the kids' attention as well. But what I found was that the kids immediately started talking about the fact that it seemed as though it was something that happened at home too.
Yeah, sure.
That, you know, kids running around, being noisy, and there's this multiple conversation going on. And I thought that was wonderful, but as you've mentioned, we don't encourage that.
Yeah.
So,
and I mean, think what a beautiful lesson that was, is that in these little bodies, unfortunately, little kids are becoming much, you know, they become much more sexual beings too young. And people are writing about now the sexualization and the adultification of young children. In distorted kinds of ways, but here a mother nurses a very natural kind of thing, and rather than them sniveling and sneaking and think that's something, she just did it naturally. So now maybe that's a genuine, healthy lesson for them to say that that part of the human body is nothing to be that you need to hide or somehow or another sniggle around on the side and all of that kind of stuff. A great lesson. So.
it's wonderful.
Now, of course, you could have taken that prompt and added to the lesson.
Go ahead, I'm listening.
You know, you could have done a nice little science lesson on that.
I'm going to.
Good.
But she.
You got some visual aids?
You're pushing, aren't you?
Yeah. But you could easily extend, you know.
No, I am going to, but also she had some clothing, which was what Schwartner introduced us to, that is, you know, home prints.
Sure.
That were beautiful designs, and so she's going to bring that into the class. So, you know, I couldn't have manufactured that if I had tried.
And it wouldn't have been, if you had sought it out, it wouldn't have been authentic because it would have been decontextualized.
Yeah.
But somehow or another, that mother must have read in some way, from however way you were functioning, that the space would have been, that she was welcome in that space to be herself and to bring herself to that space, and she did. So it's a fabulous lesson for kids.
For the kids.
Yeah. Questions or comments further? Yes.
So at Trillium, we have like very high white population, primarily white students. And I just received a new student on Monday, and he is African American. And I think in the classes where there are African American students, they are in classrooms with mainly just white people.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess what I want to know is just what advice you have for us what can we do immediately right now for me to make this student feel comfortable in my classroom, or at least safe?
Okay.
No worries.
Do something. Do some lessons on diversity in your daily lives. Mm-hmm. And you put the qualifier in what kind of diversity. Let's say cultural diversity in your daily life. Mm-hmm. And one thing you can do, you can start with the kids. Remember, start at home base. So you got a bunch of white kids in your life, and ask them to do a little study of their ethnic diversity. Where did they come from? So maybe the research question, the inquiry question, where did you and your people come from? And then they may have to do a little interviewing with their grannies and their parents and all of that. And what you're trying to do, first of all, is that we want to see what kind of ethnic and cultural diversity, racial might not be it, so you're using some other ethnic and cultural diversity in our mix. So that's the first layer of learning of diversity and cultural diversity in our lives. Then they add another layer of is that as you leave this classroom and you live your life outside of the classroom, where is diversity in your life? And have them monitor things like what television programs do you watch, what kind of games you like to play, what kind of food do you prefer to eat, what kind of that kind of stuff. With the idea being is that as white students you are not isolated from diversity, you are immune. All of us in the United States are inundated in our daily lives by diversity. A beautiful little, if you want to track it specifically, ask them to monitor their normal activities, their regular activities for one day, and what they're looking for in that one day of their life, how much diversity is in their lives, and who stands behind their diversity, who helps them live that one day of their lives. And they start from the time they wake up to the time that they go to bed, and they track it. So, and they could start with, what did you wake up with? Did you wake up with an alarm clock? Who created that alarm clock for you? What did you, what clothes did you, well, let's hope they watch their little think about it. So, did you, when you took a shower, what kind of, what did you use? What kind of soap did you use? So now what you got to do is you got to read the label of soap, see where your soap was made. And of course, the whole idea is that much of these products will be made out of the United States. There are people behind the products, and the other thing is that there are some extensions of those people around the world within the United States. So you had a shower, you dressed. What did you wear? And read the label in your clothes and see where they came from. From skin to toes. Start with your underwear and everything else you're going to wear, including your socks, your shoes, the whole business. They have to track this, all of that. They figure that out. Then what did you eat? And that kind of stuff. And I think that what you could do is teach them a very powerful message that even though you might say you don't see any, you think you don't see any visible diversity in your midst, it's all around you. It's a part of your day-to-day legacy. And then beyond that point, if you wanted to keep on adding that, is that you could extend in our daily lives by, at some point, that there's some people over there that indirectly in our lives too, but we don't see them on a day-to-day basis. They have to do a little exchange program. But the exchange program is across town in Portland, not in another country. So maybe they can exchange. Your school can do an exchange with Rosa Parks. Assuming Rosa Parks' population is significantly different than your population, and they don't just do it, just come to hang out. They have to plan the exchange because there's something they want to know. They want to learn, some insights they want to gain from their exchange partners, so they have to plot it out so that when they interact with the exchange partners, they ask for what they want, rather than we just want to exchange, that stuff. Tremendous, when you put all that together and then analyze it, there's a tremendous amount of skill development in all these, in virtually every kind of skill area you would teach as a multi-subject teacher in elementary grade. There obviously would be math, science, social studies, language arts, health and hygiene, aesthetics, all of that, art, all that kind of stuff. If they complete the exchange physically, there'll be some physical ed, because they got to walk over here, so to walk to the bus stop and all that kind of stuff. Is that helpful too?
That's amazing. Really helpful. Thank you.
That should keep you busy for about 2 years.
Right.
Now, the fun thing for you when you do something like that is that debrief with your students to help them see the kind of skills that are embedded within what they're learning, so that they're not then setting aside this cultural diversity off to the side. But in the process of doing this, we are doing these different subject areas and skill areas that we're working. Or if that doesn't work, you can flip it the other way and say that, well, we're going to, in literacy, we're going to start to do something, and this is what, and then you could start some of the first kind of tracking, self-monitoring, self-studies. You could track it through literacy filters. So you can do it either way, or both ways if you want to. But You could just have a lot of fun with it.
Yeah.
I have to admit, it's admirable that you have this meeting this late to the end of the week. Tomorrow's Friday. I don't know how, as a business teacher, I'd be thinking about Friday, tomorrow's Friday. Like, and you up in here trying to be intellectual on Thursday, you better put this thing on Tuesday. Monday's no good either, Tuesday or Wednesday. But
You could come on Mondays and
oh, that's right, I'm glad you're here. It's almost time for us to official in. Let me do a little bit of, if you will, reflection on me to hopefully help you make a little bit of sense out of this. How I've shared with you, I hope is indicative of a lot of things about cultural responsive teaching. There should, as you review and reflect on this, one thing that should be very prominent in the time I've shared with you is the prolific use of examples. And what I've tried to do is go from theoretical conceptualization and facsimiles of practice that match those conceptualization by using a variety of stuff. Not examples, but recheck the variety of examples used. And one of those variety of examples is there's always been a constant presence of me, of I, all right? So I've done that. The other kind of thing that I've done is try to through my sort of silliness, suggest to you is that while cultural responsive teaching is critical, it is absolutely crucial, is also you can do it very playfully. And your playfulness doesn't have to compromise the profoundness of what you're doing. They are complements to each other. Sometimes the most powerful learning comes in playful modalities. So don't be, and remember you are dealing with children. Play is a fundamental part of their existence. So don't avoid using play as a motif and a mechanism for sending and getting through some of the most profound things that you want to teach and all of that. So my sense of being a little bit silly here and there is intentional, kind of stuff, in all kinds of ways. The other kind of thing is that I try to craft cultural responsive teaching by giving you many different kinds of dimensions or pieces of it to characterize it so it has multiple pieces, with the implicit message being is that all of you can't do cultural responsive teaching in the same way because you're not the same people. So don't try it. But rather, there are many entrees, legitimate, valid, viable pieces, dimensions of cultural responsive teaching. So find your entree. Don't try to make your own now because you might redefine it and you might be wrong. So you have to take the Geneva version. But find that entree that fits best with you and do it to the best of your ability, with the idea that others in your school will have found theirs, and then you will be complementing each other as the school moves through cultural responsiveness. If you try to mimic each other, it's a waste of effort. You're going to fail because you are not each other. You're not the same people. You don't have the same skills. You don't have the same repertoire. But you can complement each other. And there are so many ways to enter into cultural responsive teaching is that you don't have to collide with each other. There's plenty of room for everybody. So do it your way and help each other out in those processes. So the other thing that I hope that you've gotten from how I've said is that by me, I didn't name drop as much as I could have, but enough to let you know is that my story of cultural responsive teaching is not constructed alone, but there are other scholars. So even though I might say, this is what I say as cultural responsive teaching, in that sense I'm using I the way Nikki Giovanni did as an example in Ego Tripping, if you know that poem. And what she did was she talked about African American cultural movement, or the diaspora, if you will, as the African ancestral beginnings begin to disperse across the world. But she used the collective I. She always talked about I was born in the Congo and went someplace else. But she's not talking about herself personally. Rather, she's personalizing the collective. So in some ways, that's what I ended up doing, is a collective kind of portrayal, incomplete, but the beginning of a portrayal of cultural responsive teaching, but it is notated or codified in the language of the personal. And in some ways, it's to send the messages to do cultural responsive teaching very effectively. You have to deal with it on both the professional level and a personal level. If you try to do one without the other, you're going to get a skewed mess. Right? So I mean, you know, go for it. And it's delightful. It is absolutely delightful to get in part of this way in all kinds of ways. It's one of the most gratifying things for me, I would say, throughout my entire professional career. I just love it, you know? It's just, you don't need to, and you can save a lot of money, so you don't need to go buy booze. You don't need to come down to Washington and get your medical supply. To get your medical supply and all of that. These artificial stimulants, it's all within. You just ride high all the time. Let's go, man. Right? I just love the way he blushes. I hope you don't mind.
Oh, no, I'm okay.
You know, at this point we should start because Geneva has to catch a train. Thank you, Geneva.
You're quite welcome.
All right. Did you hear that?
Yes.
So we have this idea. Maybe you can come to this class.
You guys don't meet in the same anymore?
Well, we actually, I guess, right.
Claudia, isn't it?
Yeah.
I used to be high school. They first started. Like, Claudia, I think I need to start that rap.
Being 40 years old.
You love what? I got a dick thing.
Oh, really? Oh, wow.
She's about 70.
Alan?
I'm bad, yeah.